Well, I want to welcome up Suzy McCall right now. Suzy is another person who is on the ground doing amazing ministry. She is small but mighty, and I'm sure she's feeling intimidated coming up after Gwen's story. So let's welcome her now as she shares her story.
Buenas noches. About 15 years ago, we were having a very discouraging day at our inner city ministry in Colonia Flor del Campo in Tegucigalpa, Honduras. A few years earlier, we had opened a little daycare there, and as the children outgrew daycare, we had started a little school. And we loved ministering to those children. It's one of those big, sprawling slum neighborhoods, lots of gang activity, violence, unemployment, but also just a lot of great families trying to help their children get an education and have a future. And our little group was working really hard with those families and those children. But that day we were gathered around a table and we were being told by the accountant that we couldn't afford to keep the school open. We just didn't have any money. So we sat with that for a bit, and nobody had any solutions. And so after a while, I just said, well, why don't we all go home and we'll talk about it again tomorrow? Because nobody wanted to say, well, that's it then, we're going to have to close the school. So I was living about a block from the school up a little hill on a dirt road with my foster children. And I was kind of trudging home full of thoughts about that depressing meeting. And I saw these two little girls walking towards me from the other direction. And I didn't recognize them. They weren't children who went to our school or were part of our programs. And one of them was swinging a little kerosene can, and they were dressed in old clothes and flip-flops, and like most of the children in the neighborhood. And one of the girls was staring at me, and as we passed each other on the road, she said to me, "Esta es tu escuela, ¿verdad? That's your school, right?" Sí. And she said, "El otro año yo voy a estar ahí. Next year, I'm going to be there." That settled it for me. By the time I had that brief encounter, I'd been in Honduras for 15 years already, and I had been working in that neighborhood for about 8 years. It wasn't the first time that Jesus had spoken to me through a child, or through a poor person, or a destitute person, a desperate person. I had grown to learn that it's really true that Jesus appears to us through the least of these. He speaks to us, he directs us, he teaches us, he confronts us through the least of these. And what I want to talk about a little bit tonight is that being a long-term missionary means sometimes being willing to be taught in that way, being directed in that way. I like to use the word long-term instead of career missionary because very early on, it was impressed upon me by people close to me, maybe my own family even, that a mission is not a career. It's not even a real job. And that it was imperative that I get that out of my system and come back and get a real job. And for years, those voices from different people, well, when are you going to come back? You know, you're not getting any younger. It's going to be harder and harder for you to find a real job. much less a career. So being a long-term missionary means it's essential to not let those negative voices cloud our call. God calls us to mission. And there are many, many voices out there that would discourage us from carrying on. We mustn't listen to those voices. They start even before we go to the field. Surely you don't want to throw your life away in that place. So when I first got to Honduras in 1991, I got there a little bit ahead of our church planting team that Sam's was putting together in Tegucigalpa. So I was on my own for a few months, and I was assigned to work at the Episcopal Boys' Home in Tegucigalpa until the rest of the team got there. And so I had to find a place to live and start practicing my 4-month-old Spanish and get acclimated. So my first full day in Tegucigalpa, I rented a house that was shown to me by a taxi driver. And that's another story that I'm not going to tell tonight. But I didn't know anything about the city, and so the house seemed fine to me. It was within the budget that Sam had given me, and it was suitable in my mind. It didn't have anything in it, and I only had my clothes, but I started working on that. So by Saturday of that week, I didn't have any clothes to wear because I had to wash my clothes on a pila by hand, which is really hard work if you've never done it. And I had hung them out, and they had dried, but they were very wrinkled. And I didn't have an iron. And I had noticed that my Honduran neighbors did not leave the house in wrinkled clothing. No matter how poor they were, they dressed as well as they could when they left the house. And I didn't want to be the one in the neighborhood to go out the door rumpled. So I was in a quandary because the next day we had church and I didn't have anything suitable to wear. So I was fretting about that, and I heard a voice out in the street. Lavo plancho, lavo plancho. I wash, I iron, I wash, I iron. Bingo, right? So I ran to the door, and I called to the woman. It's an older woman, and she came running over, and I told her my problem, and she started to come into my house. And I said, I don't have an iron. No hay problema, she said, no problem. She would just take my clothes and iron them at her house and bring them back. Well, I was feeling very pleased with myself because I handled that transaction in Spanish and solved my problem, except that I never saw those clothes again. So, what is another characteristic of a long-term missionary? You're willing to be humbled, maybe even humiliated, over and over and over. I could tell many more stories on myself. While you're learning a language and a culture, I have to say, though, that those stories, those experiences, are part of what it means to fall in love with the place. Because the host, at least in Honduras, the people are so very affirming and loving and so eager to make you feel a part of who they are and of their lives. So, what am I doing now at almost age 65? I'll be 65 this year. I missed the boat on the career and the real job. And our ministry, school has grown, and the daycare, and we're adding on to the daycare soon. We have a children's home now out in the country, and lots of beautiful things going on for Jesus, in the name of Jesus. And one of the most wonderful things that's happened over the years is that the Hondurans have taken on all of the leadership roles in the ministry. A young woman who grew up in Flor del Campo and worked at all kinds of different jobs with us over the years while she went to school, eventually got her master's degree in education and is the director of our school there now. The director of our ministry on the field became a born-again Christian with her husband as part of our church planting project with Sam's 30 years ago. And then about a year ago, we hired a new project director, and he's a young man who grew up in our children's home. He came to us when he was 8 years old, and now he's an architect. And as soon as he graduated, we hired him to work with us. Beautiful young man who loves the Lord. And very recently, one of my own foster children, who came to live with me when she was 3 years old and is now 27 years old, became our volunteer and teams coordinator for the ministry. And my two oldest adopted children, Mary Elizabeth and Noah, are both in full-time ministry. Marty works with us as a teacher, and Noah works with Jericho Ministries with Betsy Haig. So the young people are taking over, and that's a wonderful thing. And just this week, day before yesterday, during the Sam's retreat, I got an email that informed me that my two youngest foster children, who are 9 and 11, Sammy and JoJo, have just finally been cleared to be adopted. They've been with our family since they were infants, both of them. And they're very eager to be McCall's. So I suppose I'm going to have to keep going for a few more years to keep them moving on. So long-term mission, which is what I'm really plugging tonight, is so gratifying, so satisfying. There are some very, very hard times, some long days, there are some long years. There are lean times and not so lean times. But I don't know anybody personally who's a long-term missionary who regrets saying yes to that. And I know I don't. When I think about my years in Honduras, I'm just filled with a sense of gratitude to God. Because I've always wondered why he would call somebody like me. That him, just as I am. He took me just as I was, and he'd had some pretty raw material to work with. And I don't know that I've come such a huge, long way in some areas. But I do know that it's been the desire of my heart to love the Lord with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind and all my strength, and to love my neighbor as myself. And the question in that passage is, well, who is my neighbor? I can't answer that question for you if the Lord is calling you to mission. But I know my neighbors are in Honduras. For as long as the Lord and Sam's and Lamb will keep me there, as long as I have breath in my body, that's where you'll find me. Thank you very much.